The U.S. ambassador to the EU, that's Gordon Sondland, went before the Democratic committees, Democratic-led committees, at the spear tip of the impeachment inquiries today, behind closed doors, giving his testimony. Now, you may remember Sondland is one of the figures that we have seen in the emails and text messages that went back and forth between various diplomats involved in the efforts to get Ukraine to do what President Trump wanted. And so today was the first chance that Democrats had to question Sondland about exactly what happened and what wasn't said in the texts. And it was behind closed doors, but, and I don't know if everyone got a copy or if it was just the Wall Street Journal, but the Wall Street Journal posted Sondland's opening statement. And he's pretty thorough in terms of covering all the topics you would expect him to cover. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a quick little, and by quick I mean not quick at all, just give the highlights of what Sondland has to say today and what he doesn't have to say, and along the way I'll annotate it with what we already know or what we still need to know. One thing he does in the beginning, after he thanks the Academy for this award, etc., he makes a point of saying all the Democrats he's worked with. I worked briefly with former Vice President Biden's office and admire his long record of public service. So he's establishing his credentials. He's not a Corey Lewandowski. He's not there to be combative. He's advertising, I'm here to tell you what you want to know. Please don't throw me in jail. I will tell you. So that might not be true, but that's the ad that he's offering at the beginning of his statement. So I'm going to go through them as he does, in the order he does. Referring to the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, who was, of course, summarily dismissed earlier this year, with apparently Trump's blessing, and for reasons that remain unclear. Here's what Sondland says about Yovanovitch. I worked with Ambassador Yovanovitch personally during my first official visit to Ukraine in February 2019. Keep in mind, Sondland only came on board last year. Sondland continues, and I found her to be an excellent diplomat with a deep command of Ukrainian internal dynamics, the U.S.-Ukraine relationship, and associated regional issues. Russia. She was a delight to work with during our visit to Odessa, Ukraine. I was never a part of any campaign to disparage or dislodge her, and I regretted her departure. So he's doing a couple things there. He's delegitimizing the removal of Yovanovitch, but he's also legitimizing her testimony before these committees. And then he does the same thing with the two main diplomats who are on those text messages with him, Ambassador Taylor and Special Envoy Volker. I'm blanking now on Taylor's first name. But those are the two people on the text messages with him. Taylor was the highest ranking diplomat, U.S. diplomat in Ukraine following Yovanovitch's removal. Volker was the special envoy tasked with the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Taylor, I believe, is expected to testify next Tuesday. So Sondland, again here, is burnishing their credentials. He's saying believe them. He's going out of his way to talk about essentially their credentials. I found Taylor to be an insightful, strategic, and effective representative of U.S. interests. He cares deeply about the future of Ukraine and is a dedicated public servant. And this is a theme I want to get back to, which is Sondland doesn't give us any bombshells, but cases like this, especially if we think in terms of like a criminal trial, you don't always get bombshells. What you often get are pieces. So someone can say, in this case, for instance, President Trump never mentioned Biden to me. All he talked about is corruption. And then you get another witness, and so that person hasn't said anything untrue. They haven't put Trump in jail by saying all that Trump wanted was us to deal with corruption. But then witness number two can come in and say, when I spoke with Trump about corruption, all he talked about was Biden. Now we understand it's the transitive property, basically, of quid pro quo. If we know that in the public eye, or with people he did not trust, Trump referred to corruption only, but that with people he did trust and in communiques where he did not think he would be revealed, he revealed that corruption to him equaled Biden. Transitive property gives us quid pro quo. And Sondland seems to be establishing one part of that equation. In fact, here's one of the first instances where he implicitly tosses Trump under the bus, right? The defense of Trump so far has been, well, corruption was a real issue in Ukraine, so of course the American president, just like Biden, just like any number of other politicians, of course they would pressure Ukraine to do more about corruption. Corruption, however, is a concept. And when it comes to doing something about the concept, you have to actually act on the specifics. And most people, I'm sure, in the United States, and I got bashed for, not bashed, I was critiqued. It was a valid critique for talking about low information voters the other day. But there are lots of low information voters. And by the way, that's not an insult. A lot of people say, I want nothing to do with politics. Well, that's why you have low information. But the point is that if you asked the average American, let alone the average voter, what specific noun do you associate with Ukrainian corruption? The vast majority of people would say, I have no idea what the hell you're talking about. So it doesn't seem odd or unusual to find out that Trump was focusing on a bank with that had Hunter Biden on its board, right? That certainly seems to raise eyebrows, in the absence of other information about other particulars. So once you understand that there were other particulars, that there were more pressing cases, that makes Trump's focus on Burisma, the bank where Hunter Biden worked, that makes the focus more unusual and more questionable. And that is exactly what Sondland does here. He says, he's talking generally about long-standing efforts and the reason behind them for fighting corruption in Ukraine, specifically talking about wanting to make it easier for outside money to come in and know that they were not going to get ripped off. He doesn't put it quite that way, but you get the point. But then he says, as one example, we frequently had conversations with Ukrainian leaders about transparency and corporate governance issues involving Naftogaz. That's I believe, a natural gas company in Ukraine, which has lots of ties to American interests, American money, and lots of corrupt history. So this is Sondland saying, yeah, corruption was on our radar. We frequently, he says, talked about Naftogaz. So what he's doing is, by contrast, he's suggesting Burisma was not number one on the FBI's most wanted list in Ukraine. There were other bigger targets. He's aberrationalizing, he's turning Trump's focus into Burisma into an aberration. Here's where it gets up close and personal. Here's sort of the linchpin. On May 23rd, 2019, just 3 days after the new president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is inaugurated, Sondland actually meets with President Trump and key aides at the White House. Sondland and others emphasized, that's Sondland's words, to Trump, the strong mandate from the Ukrainian people that Zelensky had to fight corruption. Okay, so the U.S. ambassador to the European Union has just told President Trump, the guy who lives in the White House, that this guy won office on a strong mandate to fight corruption, and he's only been in office 3 days. Quote, however, President Trump was skeptical that Ukraine was serious about reforms and anti-corruption, and he directed those of us present at the meeting to talk to Mr. Giuliani, his personal attorney, about his concerns. There's a lot going on in that sentence. On what basis was Donald Trump skeptical about Zelensky's commitment to fighting corruption? On what empirical grounds did he have for that skepticism? We don't know. And then the fact that Sondland, pardon me, refers to Mr. Giuliani, quote, as his personal attorney. Right? That's a gratuitous little clause to throw in there, but that's part of the point Sondland's about to make. So Sondland comes out of the meeting with Volker, the special envoy, and Energy Secretary Rick Perry, and says that the three of them, quote, were disappointed by our debriefing with President Trump. We strongly believe that a call and White House meeting between President Trump and Zelensky was important and that these should be scheduled promptly and, emphasis added, without any precondition. We were also disappointed by the president's direction that we involved Mr. Giuliani. Our view was that the men and women of the State Department, not the president's personal lawyer, should take responsibility for all aspects of U.S. foreign policy towards Ukraine. So here he's delegitimizing the process that Trump followed. Then he says explicitly, I did not understand until much later that Mr. Giuliani's agenda might have also included an effort to prompt the Ukrainians to investigate Vice President Biden or his son, or to involve Ukrainians in the president's 2020 re-election campaign. So Sondland is saying, I was well aware of one half of that transitive property equation. I did not know about this other part of the equation, which would be a bad thing, until I did. And now I know both parts of the equation, and so do you. All right, let's continue on here. John Bolton, who was then the National Security Advisor, ostensibly heading up the National Security Council, was in opposition to Trump and Zelensky meeting. But Sondland has no idea why. And then he says, no one in the NSC ever communicated to me any concerns about our efforts, meaning Sondland's efforts to make a meeting happen, to secure military aid for Ukraine. No one told me that there was any problem with the course we were pursuing. None of the, referring now to summaries that Sondland got of communications between Trump and Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, Sondland says, quote, none of the brief and general call summaries I received contained any mention of Burisma or former Vice President Biden, nor even suggested that President Trump had made any kind of request of President Zelensky. So Sondland's doing a couple things here. He's saying, I was not in the room when it happened. That was not me. They were doing stuff. And that's the second part. They were doing stuff. He's telling us that not only that he was on the outs, but that he was kept on the outs. He's essentially giving them another example of consciousness of guilt on someone's part who made the decision not to tell even Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the European Union, about these requests coming ultimately from President Trump, apparently through his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani. Okay, so that led me to wonder, well, after Trump directed you to talk to Rudy Giuliani, what did Rudy have to say? And we don't get too much detail from Sondland here, but my guess is we're going to get more, especially once Taylor testifies. But Sondland does say that he did have exchanges, communications, never face-to-face, apparently only on the phone or text message or email. And he says, quote, in these short conversations, Mr. Giuliani emphasized that the president wanted a public statement from President Zelensky committing Ukraine to look into anti-corruption issues, which again, as Sondland has essentially confirmed here, anti-corruption was code for Biden. Mr. Giuliani, continuing now, specifically mentioned the 2016 election, including the DNC server and Burisma. And if anti-corruption isn't code for Biden, Burisma is 100% code for Biden. I think it might literally be an anagram of Biden in Ukrainian. I'm making that up, but I'm making it up because it's funny. Mr. Giuliani specifically mentioned the DNC server and Burisma as two anti-corruption investigatory topics of importance for the president. So now the transitive property isn't even corruption to Biden. Now it's Burisma to Biden. And really the only reason anyone has ever given for the US to be interested in Burisma corruption is Biden. There's certainly not some other theory of Burisma corruption that we're aware of President Trump knowing about, let alone communicating to the Ukrainians. And if Sondland hasn't already made his feelings clear about Giuliani and his role, here's how he wraps up his thoughts on Giuliani. Let me be clear, Mr. Giuliani does not work for me or my mission, and I do not know what official or unofficial role, if any, he has with the State Department. So there he's saying it wasn't even clear to us what the hell Giuliani was doing in this mix. Whose portfolio was he carrying? Who was he answering to? Who was he answerable to? To my knowledge, he is one of the president's personal lawyers. However, my understanding was that the president directed Mr. Giuliani's participation, that Mr. Giuliani was expressing the concerns of the president, and that Mr. Giuliani had already spoken with Secretary Perry and Ambassador Volker. So now he's saying the transitive property of Giuliani equals Trump. So he's saying essentially in any future testimony you get, whatever you hear is coming from Giuliani, I'm telling you now, you can do a find replace, take out Giuliani and insert Trump in there. And he's also telling them, ask Perry and Volker what Giuliani, Trump, said to them. And again, he says, although Mr. Giuliani did mention the name Burisma in August 2019, I understood that Burisma was one of many examples of Ukrainian companies run by oligarchs and lacking proper corporate governance. Again, he's making it abnormal. The focus on Burisma is abnormal, given that it's one company of no more and potentially less corrupt practices than, as in his words, many others. So justify that focus on Burisma. It's very hard to without quid pro quo. Almost done here. So here's where it gets a little interesting in terms of Sondland's own culpability and what he actually knows. And maybe we'll find out more from the testimony, the closed-door testimony, if any of it comes out. He says, to the best of my recollection, I do not recall any discussions with the White House on withholding U.S. security assistance from Ukraine in return for assistance with the president's 2020 re-election campaign. I recall that in late July 2019, Volker and Taylor and I exchanged emails in which we all agreed that President Zelensky should have no involvement in 2020 U.S. presidential election politics. And that raises the question of, well, why would you talk about it, right? What's the instigating event, communication, directive that leads you to say it shouldn't happen? Lots of things shouldn't happen. Meteors shouldn't strike the earth. Why are you talking about this one unless there was something that precipitated that discussion? That notion was obviously out there. So let's hear where it came from. And then again, 1 month later, September 9th, 2019, Ambassador Taylor raised concerns about the possibility that Ukrainians could perceive a linkage between U.S. security assistance and the president's 2020 re-election campaign. Well, why? Why could they perceive that linkage? And I'm assuming that's going to be question 1 on Tuesday, if I'm correct, and that's when Taylor's going to be testifying. Now, at this point, following that September 9th, 2019 exchange with Taylor, Sondland is so concerned about this, he says, quote, I called President Trump directly. I asked the president, what do you want from Ukraine? The president responded, quote, nothing. There is no quid pro quo. The president repeated, no quid pro quo, multiple times. Still quoting Sondland here. This was a very short call, and I recall the president was in a bad mood. Let's take this piece by piece. What do you want from Ukraine? The president responded, nothing. That's not true. We know he wanted a public statement about corruption. We know he wanted anti-corruption efforts. He's said so on camera to the world. We know this already. So why would he tell Sondland nothing unless he understood, Trump himself understood, that now he was being asked, what do you want as your quid for the quo? So what he's saying here is no quid pro quo. I don't want anything. The ask is still there. He's just saying, I don't want anything in return, which we already know is not true. The fact that you say no quid pro quo does not mean there's no quid pro quo. Let's do an example. I'm not doing a live webcast on YouTube right now. In fact, I am, but I just said it. I wasn't. Still true. Okay. And then Sondland goes on to say that corruption is bad, basically, including the stuff that is alleged to have happened here. And then he makes what I think is a fairly appropriate point. Just sort of wrapping up now, he says, Ukraine is not a dirty word. Ukraine is a fragile democracy fighting against a brutal and unscrupulous Russian neighbor. And I actually think it's fair and important to keep in mind that Ukraine is not an existential thing through which everything that passes becomes corrupt. There are real flesh and blood people suffering there. There are good people there trying to make things better. So it's important, I think, that we avoid transitive propertying Ukraine into corruption. It's an entire country, and it's a mess, certainly, but it's important not to just sort of caricaturize the country and consider that just because there have been efforts, not just internally, but also externally from the US to exploit some of Ukraine's vulnerabilities, doesn't mean that we ought to reject Ukraine. It just means we need to look at our house and clean up what's going on here. And I want to do something a little unusual, at least for me today, which is I've got a couple more stories that I want to hit real quickly in a little bit. But you guys have been on fire in the chat box, so this is the time right now when I'm going to hop into the chat box. So if you have a question about anything I've said so far, put it in now, and we'll pick it up in real time, and I'll check out your conversations as later. Clayton Shake, hello Clayton, says X-Force, correct. There is a difference between social democracy and democratic socialism. Only time I'm engaging in that combo because I'm actually listening to Jonathan. Thanks, Clayton. Okay, you guys are deep in the poli-sci conversation here, I see. Okay, Leonardo da Vinci asks, what did you have for breakfast? So what did I have for breakfast? I had cereal, and then I had frozen pepperoni, like mini pizzas, a couple of those. Oh, and I had an ice cream pop. And the reason I had such a weird, unhealthy breakfast is because I'm trying to lose weight at the moment, and the regimen that I'm on is basically self-created. This is totally not for anyone to follow. I hereby disavow it for anyone who's a biological human being. But essentially, I'm able to deprive myself the food I want at night by thinking, you know what, I can have it in the morning. So I indulge myself in the morning and pray that Leonardo DiCaprio doesn't ask me what I just had for breakfast. And then I basically have just like an apple or a salad maybe later on and try to drink a lot later on. So that's what I had for breakfast. Oh, you guys are still fighting. Red Hood says I should go on Majority Report with Sam Cedar. I agree, and I think you guys should flood Sam's mentions saying, where's that TYTI Daily guy, Jonathan Larson? How come you don't have him on more often? And just to be clear, I go back many years with Sam, back to Air America Radio. So I'm a friend of Sam's, I'm a fan of Sam's, and he's better at this than I am. So I have no grudge toward anyone who says, well, it's time to go watch Majority Report. Jess Love is Louder says, have cottage cheese in the morning. That helps you feel full and burns calories. I haven't tried cottage cheese in about 1,000 years, but maybe I'll go back and give it a try. That whole feeling full and burning calories, that's a nice mix for that. Okay, you know, this happens every time. Anytime you mention trying to lose weight, people are like, I am going to talk about that. That's interesting to me. Sherry Addis says, best weight loss program is eat only until the hunger pains are gone and eat every time the hunger pains return. So the way I've been doing it is when my hunger pains kick in the evening, I know, oh, good, that's the smell of me burning off some fat. So that's when I don't eat or try not to. Okay, you guys are fighting about stuff, which is okay, as long as we're keeping it civil. Scuba Steve, hello Scuba Steve. I feel like maybe I've seen you before, but if you are new, welcome. Thanks for checking us out. Says a bit off topic, but do you think that having 12 candidates on the debate stage is on purpose to take time away from Biden, Warren, and Sanders, which helps Biden? No, I do not. It's difficult for me to convey just how politically uninterested and unstrategic most, not all, most of the people planning these things are. It's just, I mean, if you go to their, here's the tip off. If you go to their Twitter profiles, assuming any of these executives or people are on Twitter, you'll usually find their job and then stuff about sports. That's where their passion is. So if they're saying 12, it's literally because someone said, yeah, no, we can fit that many on the stage. Oh, great. Well, then let's do that, because that way we don't lose another night of primetime programming where we can sell a lot more ads. So one of the reasons people don't like my media analysis is because I've been there in these organizations, and I know that the answers are relatively prosaic / even more depressing than strategic corruption or political putting thumb on scales. Let's see. You guys are all, okay, I'm going to talk about food, I guess. We're not talking about Sondland anymore. So Mr. Elder says, I have to force myself to eat because I never feel hungry, not unless I go a few days without eating. I try not to do that. It's not healthy. No one wants to hear about this, Mr. Elder. No one wants to hear that you can go a day without eating and that you have to remind yourself to eat. Go. Just get out. You can come back tomorrow, but us folks here trying to shed pounds, trying to lose the belly flab, trying not to eat that other ice cream pop that we happen to know is right there waiting for us. We don't need this kind of toxic stuff. Nails and Glitter says, I'm against democratic socialism because racism is too prevalent to help certain people. Racism is so ingrained in our country, I can't support it even though there are good points. Let's see. X4 says, and I'm picking up the conversation here, X4 says, phone calls really do matter. Clayton Shake, call them and tell them what you think. They aggregate the info and pass it on to the rep. If they get 10,000 calls about something, they're going to act. So I don't know what topic specifically you're talking about, but that's true. And it's true of media as well. It's very easy to be cynical and say there's no point in talking to these people. It actually can work. It really can work. And on a small scale, I can tell you, like, I look at the comments and I try to be, when folks call me out on something, I try to be conscious of it and think through, is that a valid point? Why is it valid from their perspective, even if it's not valid from mine? Can I honor that perspective in some way without compromising mine? So I actually did, before I joined TYT, I worked on this guide to media, which was sort of like the Indivisible Guide, only I called it the Indivertible Guide. And part of it was about how to get media to suck less. And if you go to the effing news, THEFING news.com/indivertible, you can check it out. And it talks about exactly that. They are vulnerable to input. And when I say vulnerable, I don't just mean open to, I mean, like, literally there are vulnerabilities you can exploit if you're strategic and organized about it. Monkey King says, processed foods make you fat, sick, and lazy. That is correct. That is correct. And I'm trying to do better, both in terms of the quantity and the quality. Leonardo da Vinci says, all the Leonardos you've had in the chat in the past was me, FYI. I actually have developed my own made-up conspiracy theory involving Leonardo da Vinci, so I'm going to have to fold Leonardo DiCaprio into that too now, apparently. James Stark says, Do you believe Bernie has a chance even with the DNC rigging the primaries? I left out the derogatory ad hominem about the DNC because that's how I roll. Do I believe Bernie has a chance even with the DNC rigging the primaries? So I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to when you talk about rigging the primaries. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just saying I don't know which aspect you're talking about. But yeah, I totally think Bernie has a chance. Ask Michael Dukakis whether campaigns can change with one bad night. Lots of things can happen. A lot of these folks are in it still, not despite the fact that they have no chance now, because they might have a chance later, right? It doesn't matter that they're at 2% in the polls now. If there's been a lot written lately, and I don't disagree with it, about how Buttigieg, if Biden just decides, you know what, who needs this crap? I'm out. Buttigieg is very well positioned to pick up the mantle of the centrist or left centrist, or however he wants to position himself, who's most palatable to Biden supporters. Although I did see someone talking about how a lot of Biden supporters would actually go to Warren or Sanders. So, anything can happen, So, yeah, sure, Bernie has a chance. Monkey King says, do not eat the king's food. I don't know what that's a reference to, but I like it. X-Force says, I should start at the top. So now we're at the argument again about where I should start in the chat box. So let's see, X-Force. I'm going to take a quick peek at the top and we'll see what that gives me. Probably not anything about diet, but you might be right. It might be about Sondland. So let's go to the top. Condolences are being expressed regarding the loss of Congressman Elijah Cummings, which was, of course, a tragedy and just a punch in the gut surprise this morning. James Stark asks, will Donald Trump finally go to prison? Speculation he'll go to New York, prison in New York. X-Force says, who are the 40 people watching that can't press a thumbs up button? Wow, the righteous indignation against people for not sharing their metrics on YouTube. Kalita says Ivanovich is Ukraine's former president, right? I'm blanking now on the previous guy's name. It's like Poroshenko, something like that. Yovanovitch was the ambassador to Ukraine. That's correct, the U.S. ambassador. Mr. Elder says, I like to think of TYT Investigates as pre-show to Majority Report, which I certainly take as a compliment, so thank you very much. Sherry Addis says, yay, I made it in time. Talking about the 25th Amendment on removing a president for incapacity. Mike Hawkins says, when is the hearing? I believe it's happening now, or may even be over, but it's today. This is the Sondland testimony, not a hearing. Does it qualify as a hearing? I'm not sure. It might. Forgive me if I corrected you wrongly there. But it's a closed door. So what we have is the testimony that the Wall Street Journal and maybe others printed as well. And my guess is we'll get some details about what Sondland said under questioning. Okay, everyone's talking about other stuff besides Sondland. Radama says, I was watching some Trump clips from when he was campaigning. He used to act like a normalish person sometimes. Securing this amount of power has changed his outward expression a lot. And I think that that's an underappreciated dynamic. There's a lot of talk about whether he's, suffering from dementia or, he's a sociopath, like all of this stuff. This is the madman fallacy. I don't know if that's a real name for it, but this is the name I've come up with, and we usually see it in American foreign relations. This notion that international leaders are doing things we don't like, despite the fact that we are incentivizing or trying to incentivize them not to do those things. And we simply conclude they're insane. They somehow managed to navigate the socio-political lattice of their entire nation's power structure to become the leader, despite being insane. And now there's just no reasoning with them, so I guess I gotta bomb them. The madman fallacy is an escape hatch for American leaders who don't want to grapple with what actually incentivizes overseas leaders, not just including, but primarily their own domestic politics and their own politics with their immediate bordering neighbors, right? There are other incentives they're responding to: internal rivals, external enemies, external allies. And it's so easy to just label someone a madman, but that gets you nowhere. All that does is justify violence, and that's not a good thing, because you've said they're immune to reason. Nice try, not true. And same thing, I would argue, is true of Trump. I thought before he was elected that the nature of his personality, as he displayed it in the campaign, was such that he was enormously vulnerable to manipulation by the Democrats. And I feel for the Democrats, because the Democratic Party was in a tough position of very validly, reasonably wanting to condemn his homophobia, his xenophobia, his racism, his sexism, his misogyny, fill in the blank. Of course you want to condemn that, but it's hard for me not to wonder whether engaging with him in a different way would have made it possible, maybe not to cure the rhetoric, but to prevent the actual actions that have since then materially hurt the lives of those people. And I don't have the right answer for how you pull that off, that magic trick of not allowing the normalization of that rhetoric, but also still manipulating the guy through his ego, through his vanity, through his insecurities, whatever it might be, to do the right thing. And look, I don't mean to sound coy here, but power dynamics are a real thing. I've worked in cable news. I've worked with people who've had considerable amounts of power and have been criticized as being, oh, that guy's nuts or whatever. They're not nuts. They're responding to the incentives, the lack of boundaries put up by the people around them. People's desires will expand if no one ever pushes back. Is anyone pushing back against Trump? I highly doubt it. Anyone in a position to, I mean. Red Hood says, I didn't know you knew Sam Cedar well. That's very interesting. I appreciate your work and I try to watch live when I can. Thank you for responding to my chat. I shouldn't claim I know Sam well. We're not intimates, I wouldn't say, but I could certainly give him a call and he would call me back and we would talk about things that weren't intimate. Let's see. Trifacto, welcome Trifacto, it's nice to see you here, says Trump won because of Clinton. That's true. It's also true that Trump won because of Comey. It's also true that Trump won because of Trump. It's also true that Trump won because of about 3 million people or less, I think, who didn't vote. It's also true that he won because of state party chairs who didn't get out the vote in their state. When an election is narrow, the margin of victory is narrow, and I realized it wasn't this, it was this, because Clinton obviously won the popular vote. But this is something I experienced firsthand. I was working as a reporter in Brooklyn when Rudy Giuliani narrowly beat David Dinkins, the incumbent black mayor. And by the way, I actually met and knew Rudy Giuliani back then, back in the early 90s, and he was not this guy. But the point is that after Giuliani narrowly beat Dinkins, there was a lot of, oh, well, Giuliani beat him because of this, because of that. When it's narrow, it's because of virtually anything you want to point a finger at, anything that caused a tiny number of people not to vote or to flip their vote. You can blame all of those factors. Let's see. Michael Diz, I'm not sure I'm saying that correctly, says Trump won because of Putin. So here's a pet peeve of mine, and here's where you guys can go to town flaming me here. I do not think that Putin meddled in our elections. I don't mean that any of the findings of the FBI do not strike me as accurate or factual. What I mean is that meddling in elections, an election is a one-day event. Yes, you've got early voting, et cetera, et cetera. But the election is the act of voting. We elect presidents by voting. That's an election. In our everyday parlance, we use election as a shorthand when we're actually referring to the campaign. I do think Putin meddled in the campaign by putting out information which became part of the campaign, which affected how people would ultimately vote. So he didn't meddle in. When you say someone meddled in the election, that implies they switched votes in the voting booth. If all that happened was Putin or his operatives or whatever, with or without Putin's knowledge, injected crap into our bloodstream, that's only meddling in our campaign because we responded to it, right? We're not sufficiently immune, and that's a pseudo-accidental continuation of my injection analogy. We're only pseudo-immune to this stuff because of a couple things. We're not, generally speaking, good at figuring out what's true and what's not when information is presented to us. That's how our brains are wired. That's not a cultural thing. Our brains did not evolve to teach us how to use Google and to discern a good news source from a bad news source. Our brains did not work that way. Our brains evolved to believe the guy who says, this is absolutely true and I'm telling it to you and you've got to believe it because it's really important. And to disbelieve the guy who says, you know, I'm not exactly sure about this, but I think it's likely that blah, blah, blah. The guy yelling at you is clearly the less reasonable, less thoughtful person, but our brains are wired such that we take that more seriously. And so I think Putin meddled in the campaign to the extent that he knew how to, not him, people understood how to get people to pay attention to things that they should not when determining who should be president. Let's see. X4 says they did hack into voter databases. They did release hacked info strategically in coordination. They did provide foreign money and influence. There's no escaping the fact. And yes, it appears to be true that they were able to access some voting systems, but as far as I'm aware, and that's a bad, terrible thing, and we should take steps about that and make sure it never happens again. And we've done reporting on that ourselves. We had a freelancer earlier this year or last year, I forget which, looking at, I think Kansas had a special election. And her point is paper ballots, paper ballots, paper ballots. And yes, of course. But I guess my point is just, I'm not aware of any claim that Russia went into any voting machine and said, let's change this Clinton vote into a Trump vote. Dennis Martin says the congressional questioning has moved to a criminal investigation, and this is not looking good for Giuliani or Donald Trump. FBI has moved the investigation to criminal as arrests were made. X4 says it's an act of war. I assume you're referring to the Putin stuff. And here's what I would say about that. 9/11, when it first happened, and I not only remember it, I was working for CNN in New York City on that day, so I remember it. In the first days after 9/11, it was not an act of war. It was considered a criminal act. If you go back and look at, it might have just been the first day, but in the immediate aftermath, Rudy Giuliani, who was at the time my mayor, and George W. Bush, who was at the time my president, were talking about finding the people who did this. That's not how you talk about an act of war. And since 9/11, I think we've come to adopt this rhetoric where to virtue signal is not the phrase I want to use here, but it's along those lines. To convey, to telegraph how seriously we take something, we resort now to maximalist language about the response. So I'm not sure why it's an act of war. Why can't it just be a criminal thing? Not every negative thing that another country or agents of another country does to the U.S. is an act of war. Is violating a trade treaty an act of war? If Russia had, Russia's crime wasn't putting out the disinformation. It was that they didn't disclose, right? You're allowed to put out information and even disinformation. Where this country has free speech. So what if Russia had followed all the disclosure rules and set up shop here and said, yeah, we're a Russian organization. We say so everywhere we're obliged to by law, and we're going to put out this information. Like, okay, it still would have had an effect on a lot of people because a lot of people wouldn't have cared or known where it came from. Cassidy Reese says, I don't agree with Pelosi's political views one bit, but that response to Trump was epic. I love a good clapback. Patrick Ostrand, I'm not sure how to say your name there, Patrick. I'm of Swedish and Danish descent and am terrible at the accents. Says, I think Tulsi is likely to drop out of the race soon. I think that's less likely now because she seems to be getting more attention now than she was earlier. As the field narrows, the proportion of time the remaining candidates gets increases. So there's actually kind of less of an incentive for some of these people. I don't get the sense that Tulsi's campaign model is based on needing a lot of money to keep going, which I think may be more true of like a Klobuchar. Someone said, maybe it was X-Force following up, that it's cyber warfare. Again, that's sort of a maximalist term. When I was a boy, we called it hacking, right? Do we have to label it cyber warfare? If a lone wolf from a specific country shows up in somewhere in the U.S. and unleashes a chemical weapon, is that chemical warfare? Everything now is terrorism. Everything now is warfare. That's exactly what Osama bin Laden wanted. He wanted us to see things in maximalist terms, and he wanted us to have that perspective, that maximalist perspective, compel a maximalist response. That's why 9/11 worked, because we're doing exactly that. We need to figure out how to ratchet down the rhetoric we use around things in a way that still conveys the seriousness and the moral condemnation with which we view them. Harumph. Monkey King says it's a war for your mind, body, and soul. This is a spiritual battle. I'm an atheist, so I agree with 2/3 of the mind, body, and spirit, soul thing. Monkey King says Trump is a wrecking ball. Yeah, that's fair, but I think I do subscribe to the notion that he's a wrecking ball, but we're fortunate to have that the crane he's attached to is barely functional. Imagine if someone with sort of a mainstream, or at least the hard right mainstream Republican conservative policies came into office with Trump's willingness to violate norms and trample precedent, but without his scattershot approach to everything. It was actually methodical and orchestrated things well. We'd be in much worse shape, I think. Singing Bird says, this whole escapade shows me that all government should be suspect. We need to treat government the way it is treating its own people, harshly, like the Patriot Act on steroids. Yes and no, I would say. I think government should be suspect, but let's not presume it guilty. Let's presume it innocent. It should enjoy that benefit of the doubt, I think. And we also want people to serve in government. So government should be suspect, but that, I think, the method for dealing with that is properly robust checks and balances. If we worry that Congress is an insufficient check to Trump today, We need to go back in time several decades and tell people to stop, deifying the president. We collectively as a country, because Congress is boring and who wants to engage in that, have collectively said, you know what, it's just a president thing. Whatever the president is, as long as I want to have a beer with him, that's cool. So this is the result. And again, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Doesn't mean go get your gun and stand on the wall. It means pay attention to what your local representatives are doing. Stay on top of the issues. Stay informed. Stay in touch with them. Let them know, here's what I want and don't want. James Stark says, do you think the nation is so divided that it's beyond repair? I do not. And in fact, this is going to sound weird, but I think the repair job should and could be easy. And here's what I mean by that. I don't mean that Trump supporters are very fine people. What I mean is that as of 4 years ago, the people at the core of that base, the racist, misogynistic base, they knew enough to shut the hell up. And what's happened is that they've managed to convince a fairly significant and troubling portion, but limited, right? It's capped, it hasn't moved for years, other portion of the American electorate population that to sort of subscribe to this authoritarian, xenophobic worldview. But those people, not the core, but the people they've sort of won over, they're not ideologically committed to that. This is not a political awakening. Keep in mind, we've been through this stuff very recently. You remember how rabid Sarah Palin's fans were? I mean, you'd have to go to Wikipedia now and like check external links to figure out what the hell she's even up to. This is a very fickle, thin, superficial support that he and whatever he represents at the moment stand for, enjoy. So I think the right person and the right approach, not conciliatory, if anything, just the opposite, has a good chance of winning those people back and saying, hey, so it turns out we used to be America and it was really cool and we can do that again and we want you to be a part of it. And that core that won you over for a while, they can go back to the chat boards and bitch about computer games. All right, I'm going to quickly share a couple other things because they were important and they're not getting talked about. Washington Post has a report today on has a story today on a new United Nations report released today. I'm going to read real quickly from it. More civilians have been killed and injured in Afghanistan. Goodbye, everyone. I just said Afghanistan, so I assume you're leaving now, because who the hell cares? It's just our longest war ever. It's just a breeding ground for terrorism. It's just the home of living human beings. More civilians have been killed and injured in Afghanistan in the last quarter than during any other 3-month period in the past decade, aka since George W. Bush was president. That's according to this report. In the last quarter, from July through September, 1,174 civilians were killed, 3,139 civilians were wounded. The Taliban is blamed for most of these, but that's only in very recently. In the first half of 2019, Afghan government forces, our allies, and their US-led allies, including the US, it's only the US and Afghanistan, for instance, dropping bombs from the air, were responsible for more civilian deaths than the Taliban. Afghan and US airstrikes and search operations this year have killed 784 civilians and wounded 377 of them. And US soldiers are still dying in Afghanistan. And one of the factors at play here is that, to Trump's credit, the United States, the US State Department, led by rapture theologian Mike Pompeo, American diplomats on the ground in Afghanistan were not only talking to the Taliban, which was a prima facie cardinal sin if Obama ever did it. They were talking to the Taliban, which yes, good. They were making progress. They were heading towards peace talks. They were they were heading towards a resolution. And then Trump pulled the plug. And so now we've got the highest civilian death rates, casualty rates. Casualties, if you don't know, means wounded and killed, as opposed to fatalities. We've got the highest casualty rate among civilians that we've had in the past, I think they said 10 years. And no one's reporting on this because look at all the other fun stuff there is to talk about. And I just want to give a shout out right now to you folks, because the number of people watching right now is about 160 people, which is what it was roughly before I started talking about Afghanistan. So when I said goodbye in my sarcastic a-hole way, you didn't leave, right? So here's to you for justifying my decision to do the thing you're never supposed to do and actually talk about Afghanistan. And you've sufficiently encouraged me that now I'm going to talk about that other thing we're never supposed to talk about on camera, which is, get ready to go now, climate change. 156, so we've lost 3 people now. 157, climate change gets them back in the room. Okay, this is a report from Weather Underground. Bob Henson wrote this up. This is a new National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration report. Last month, September, which includes fall, is tied for the warmest September ever. NOAA says it's tied with September 2015 as the warmest September on record. NASA says it's the second warmest September on record. The Japan Meteorological Agency calls it the second warmest September on record. The EU's Copernicus EU program says it's the warmest September on record, dating back to 1979. Here's more from NOAA. The 10 warmest Septembers ever have all occurred since 2005. So the warmest 10 have all been in the last 14 years. The 5 warmest Septembers ever have been the last 5 years. Every year for the past 5 years is now among the top 5 warmest Septembers ever. And the month that we're tied for is September 2015. Okay, so September 2015 and September 2019 are tied as the 2 warmest Septembers ever. Here's what you need to know about September 2015. September 2015 had an El Nino, which dramatically increases heating. September 2019, no El Nino, which means we got all the way to where 2015 got with an El Nino without the help of an El Nino. That's a bad thing. Global temperatures are now running more than 1 degree Celsius above the levels observed in pre-industrial days. A flashing warning sign, Bob Henson writes. And the sustained warming that we're looking at, right, that threshold number that we keep looking at is 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're now averaging 1 degree Celsius. So we're 2/3 of the way to that sort of tipping point threshold. Is there anything else from this I wanted to share? Here's the thing that made me nuts about everyone who ever said that mitigating climate change emissions was too expensive. What they meant was it was too expensive for them right then, because the bill is going to come due and it's going to be a hell of a lot larger. It already is than what we would have paid. September had $4 billion weather disasters, meaning in the month of September, there were at least 4 disasters that led to damages estimated at a value of more than $1 billion. That brings the tally so far for this year to 23. 10 of those 23 have been in the US, making it the 5th year in a row that the US has had 10 or more billion-dollar US weather disasters. And that does include inflation, by the way. So There are other kinds of horrific things there, but one thing I wanted to point out about climate change that we don't think about a lot is this. It's the steroids example. When you find out that a baseball player, and I hate sports, so if you hate sports too, just bear with me. When you find out that a baseball player has been on steroids, you go back and look at their batting average, their hitting record. These are things having to do with when they move a stick through the air to hit a ball, I'm told. You can't point to any one home run, I guess they're referred to, as being due to their steroid use. The same thing holds true of climate change. You can't point to any one event and say that happened because of climate change. That's where the science is now. But in a generation or so, that may change. We may know with much more certainty, oh yeah, that kind of event in that place at that time of year, that never happened before. We know why that happened, and it is precisely because of because of climate change. And at that point, they're going to start figuring out who did this. And that's something where even the most fervent advocates against climate change, and I hope I include myself in that, have fallen down on the job, is in naming these people, identifying them. This is who they are. These are the decisions they're making, and here's how it's going to screw us. And earlier this week, I talked about the fact that I expressed passion. Someone was noting the fact that I was harsh or passionate, I guess, about the video showing TYT, the Young Turks, being murdered by President Trump. And I came out with what was, for me, a relatively strong position that Trump had to champion, not just say it's okay, not just say don't murder journalists, but to say we need journalists. I thank them for doing what they're doing, even if I don't agree with how they do it every day, but they play a vital, essential American role in the project that is America. And we need to thank them for it rather than focus on criticizing them for it. And I thought, it's not right that I only express passionate opinions about things that have potentially a direct bearing on me, right? The president going after my company. The whole point of journalism should be that we don't indulge that subjectivity and we expand the same willingness to be passionate to things that will affect people we don't know, will never meet, haven't been born yet. Well, that's what I want to do for climate change right now. If you are in any way making things worse, and I don't mean as an individual, right? Let's not get caught up in, oh, we have to use paper straws. Nothing's going to matter without systemic change. The people who can affect systemic change, the politicians, the corporate leaders, the thought leaders, they all need to say that action is wrong. Spitting more carbons into the atmosphere, more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, that's not just bad, it's morally wrong and you need to stop. And any government that doesn't say it has to stop or you're going to prison is also bad, morally wrong, and they need to do something about it. The Green New Deal is something we're not going to get a consensus on in order to implement, no matter who wins in 2020. But the Green New Deal, in all of its ambition, would still be seen by the next generation as woefully insufficient. So if you want me to be passionate about something, I'll be passionate about this. We need to call out the people who are not, and by the way, I need to call them out too. I need to do the work of start looking up, who the hell is the CEO of Exxon these days anyway? Let's talk about that person and what they're doing. Because what we need right now is laws that phase out, and I don't mean over a decade. I mean, you get a few months, whatever it might be. We've just got to get rid of all this stuff. It's got to just stop. It's global suicide, or worse, homicide. It's doing it to others, the ones who won't be able to afford the high ground, the cooler climates. So that's my impassioned, subjective spiel on climate change. We have to call out the people in the way by name. We have to make it a public shame to be involved in the slow motion execution of the planet. And we have to demand radical measures from our leaders. And by the way, radical doesn't mean bad. Most Americans want radical measures, and radical measures are what excite people. It's not half steps that excites people. It's the notion of a calling. We're actually calling you to do something, to participate something. People crave that. People want that all the time. They want to feel that their actions have impact, that there's gravity to their decision to participate. Give it to them by asking something large of them. Go back and look at World War II, victory gardens and war bonds and all this thing. People were dying, pardon me, terrible phrasing there. People were aching to contribute, to feel like they were contributing. They were signing up for the draft and they were going overseas. And if they couldn't, they wanted to feel. It's like after 9/11, right? Everyone, myself included, we all sort of like strived to find our connections to it, to connect to it and say, oh, I actually knew that firefighter. I interviewed him for a story, which was true in my case. And oh, I used to work for that company, or I was at the World Trade Center just 2 years ago. Could have been me. People wanted to be connected to this big thing. If we want individual action to really matter, it'll come in the form of a collective action where people are actually asked to do something where they can see this will have impact, this will matter, this will make the future better, not because I'm doing it, but because I know everyone's doing it. People want to participate in that. They want to support a measure along those lines. We have to demand that. Okay, let's see. Where are you guys? We've got 136 people watching still, so I guess I didn't scare too many people away with my tirade on climate change. Leonardo da Vinci, if that's your real name, says, I've lived here in Southern California my whole life and I've never been afraid of immigrants. They are way nicer, contribute a lot to the community, great athletes, and extremely smart. Yeah. Laura Simpson says, how many in here have had to take their parents through medical bankruptcy in the US while one of them is dying? I had to do that while still living in Canada. Looks like X-Force is having trouble with another user here somewhere. I haven't seen it yet. I'll take a look. Shannon Moon says 8 trillion killing brown people and we have homeless vets. Two Time says this is fake. Not sure what you're talking about, Two Time. Let's see. Mr. Elder says, don't be trying to trigger people with your plastic straw. I'm not saying people should use plastic straws. I'm saying, and I've said this before, individual measures are these little safety valves, which I worry ease up the pressure that we feel to do something collectively, right? I feel like I have this urge to do something, and that urge is met. It's satisfied by reading online, oh, don't use plastic straws. Yay, I saved the earth, I'm done. If we didn't give people anything to do, if we said, nah, there's nothing you as an individual could do, my own theory is that a lot more people would say, I don't accept that, and I demand that we do something on a collective scale, and we would have much more energy behind collective action. So I hate the whole think globally, act locally kind of thing, because I worry that it's had that impact. And that's been true for decades. Multiple generations have grown up with that, with a cynicism towards government and a belief in their own ability to change things individually. And here we are. Michael Christian says, look at the size of this guy's house. Yes, it's so massive. You're basically seeing all of it, Michael. I switched it because I think the light from the door over there was making me look washed out or whatever, which as a pale American, I already do. Okay. Michael Christian says journalism is dead. Yeah, I mean, okay, so now what do we do, right? I think I was just talking with, actually with Jenk the other day about local journalism, and I made the point that local journalism has been sort of romanticized, but local journalism isn't necessarily that great. It's not hard to find cities and towns where the disenfranchised know all about problems that never get reported on in the press. When I was a reporter in Brooklyn, I came to a community, Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, where there were already 2 local papers. And I very quickly found out that people who were disenfranchised weren't getting heard from. Their issues weren't getting looked into. Power structures were not being challenged. We broke any number of stories about the local school board, the local community board, that these other papers basically weren't doing. One story in particular literally will still make me cry if I have a drink and start thinking about it. I only found out about it because I saw it in the local paper. They scooped me on it. It was the death of a Haitian boy, an 18-year-old, Armwoodson Morency, who died drowned on a school trip. And teachers tried to save him, and they just weren't able to resuscitate him and all of this. And that's where the story would have ended if the local journalism had been limited to that paper. I looked into it and I found out that story was not true. The local teachers did not try to save him because they were not qualified to. There was literally no one qualified to lifeguard there or to save that boy's life. But that information never would have gotten out because who cared about some Haitian immigrant 8th grader? I don't know if I said 8-year-old, he was an 8th grader. The trip was a reward for doing well, for making honor roll in 8th grade. And, didn't live in the center of the district, lived in, I'm blanking on the name of the neighborhood. It'll come to me as soon as I stop talking. But it was one of these fractured neighborhoods, so it didn't have a lot of representation on the school board. The constituency of Haitian immigrants was not represented on the school board. So there was no one speaking for this guy who had already lost his wife, the boy's mother, to cancer and was raising his kids alone. And then his honor roll 8th grade son, dies on this school trip. And the story in the local paper says, teachers tried to save him, tragedy, moving on. And that was it. So even when journalism wasn't dead, it was never perfect. It was never super healthy. So we all need to step up and do better, not just demanding it from journalism, but journalism isn't like plumbing where you have to get certified. Anyone can do it. There have been times I've broken stories when I was unemployed. You don't have to work anywhere. With the internet, anyone can break a story. So, I read all the time on Facebook things about my own community where I live in the local groups where they talk about things that the local press aren't covering. And I see my local press here doing a crappy job sometimes, and I crap on them when they do. So we have to step up, not just mourn or dance on, the grave of journalism. All right, I've been going for an hour and a quarter now, and I'm sure I have other things to do, and you guys probably do as well. So, boy, I hope the live chat survives after I shut this down, because I'm dying to see what you all have been saying. And today I've been especially bad about paying attention to you folks. So if you're new to TYTI Daily, I promise I usually pay more attention. I'm a lot more interactive. I don't know why I was so long-winded today. I apologize. Tomorrow is media analysis today. And boy, you don't want to miss that. So if you don't already, please subscribe. If you think any of this hour and a quarter, there was 2 minutes that might be worthwhile or of interest to anyone, I hope you'll share it with them and encourage them to subscribe. We need your help to keep doing better. So please help us. And as always, take care of each other, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Bye now.